Hit subscribe right now. I have some major breaking news. I threw this last-minute update together tonight because of some massive new details I was finally able to confirm. Journalist Brian Entin reportedly pointed to one specific patch of desert and said, investigators might have completely missed something huge out there the first time. That claim instantly turned heads. By this stage in the Nancy Guthrie missing person case, everyone assumed detectives had already exhausted every single angle. Search crews had thoroughly swept those massive stretches of land outside Tucson. Cyber evidence was scrubbed repeatedly. Law enforcement spent months rebuilding the timeline leading up to Nancy vanishing. So, why on earth were detectives suddenly digging through old ground? And what exactly did Brian Entin uncover that forced police to take a second look? Today, we are breaking down the absolute newest clues tied to the Nancy Guthrie case step by step, diving into missed desert evidence, timeline clashes, and why detectives allegedly think earlier search theories were completely wrong. Before we piece this timeline together, drop down and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think massive crime hunts overlook crucial evidence early on just because of extreme pressure? If you like calm, fact-based true crime coverage driven by hard logic instead of pure hype, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps me keep bringing you deep investigative updates as this mystery keeps unfolding. Let us go back to where this new lead started. For months, the entire story around Nancy vanishing was locked firmly on what happened inside her house. The glitching security cameras, those weird motion alerts, and that infamous 41-minute blank spot detectives struggled to map out. Early reports showed police totally believed the smoking gun would come from cell data and forensic traces found right there on the property. But based on recent reports from Brian Entin, cops allegedly started wondering if critical physical clues outside the house were completely ignored early on. Here is where the story twists. Reports show the harsh desert around the Tucson perimeter was scoured over and over. Ground crews, civilian volunteers, and elite tracking teams all swept the terrain. So naturally, everyone figured there was zero chance any real clues were left hiding out there. But true crime experts know the hard truth: searching a grid twice does not mean you found everything. Rain washes away dirt, sun glare, hides, shadows, and detectives often view old evidence differently once fresh tips roll in. That became huge when police allegedly found fresh timeline data showing movement way outside her immediate neighborhood. So, what does that actually mean? It means investigators allegedly realized their initial search grid might have been way too tight during those crucial first days. Let us dive into the first massive red flag Brian Entin pointed out. Reports suggest detectives zeroed in on an isolated desert trail sitting miles away from the main target zone. The spot looked totally dead at first, just cracked dirt, dead brush, and zero cars. But sources close to the investigation say, detectives drove back out there after matching up old drone footage with fresh mapping software. Once authorities adjusted the digital timeline for the exact hour Nancy vanished, weird little landscape details suddenly jumped right off the screen. Police still refused to publicly confirm what those strange details actually were. That silence speaks volumes. Experts tracking the story think police flocked back there because that dirt trail perfectly matched their newly updated timeline of the suspect movement. So, what is the takeaway? It clearly shows authorities figured their day one theories on travel speed and distance were just flat out wrong. Now, here is another wild detail. Based on leaks from the investigation, Brian Entin heavily targeted the messy search logistics during those frantic first 72 hours after Nancy went missing. That matters immensely. Any seasoned detective will tell you the first few hours of a missing person case are life or death. Search and rescue experts agree one tiny radio miscommunication on day one leaves a blind spot that is almost impossible to fix later. Detectives actually went back to see if certain zones got ignored just because the original theory kept everyone glued to Nancy's front yard instead of pushing out deep into the wasteland. Look, that does not mean anyone dropped the ball on purpose. Command posts are absolute chaos when a high-profile case first breaks. Manpower moves fast, rumors fly, and cops have to make gut calls with half the facts. But word on the street is, detectives now realize their own early bias severely handicapped those initial searches. Bottom line, police started totally rethinking not just the physical clues, but the flawed way they read them. Now, let us pivot to another massive detail. Detectives reportedly double-checked suspect vehicle tracking. Open source reports claim police dug deep into whether any ghost cars were cruising those back-alley desert trails right around the exact hour Nancy vanished. That became crucial once detectives combed back through old traffic cam footage, witness accounts, and road timing estimates linked to those critical overnight hours investigators cared about most. Here is where another alleged contradiction popped up. Some witness memories apparently pointed to activity way outside the neighborhood investigators first prioritized. But reports say those early tips were brushed off. They just seemed too sketchy or inconsistent to actually steer the initial investigation. Later though, detectives reportedly took a second look, wondering if those sightings actually matched newer reconstruction models. So, what does that mean? It means investigators thought certain early witness tips only became a big deal once the broader timeline actually started making sense. Let us talk for a second about why Brian Entin's reporting reportedly hit the public so hard. For everyone tracking the mystery, his work highlighted exactly what detectives had reportedly been wrestling with behind closed doors for months. The chilling possibility that this investigation's biggest clues were not actually hidden at all. They might have just been read wrong until fresh evidence forced detectives to rethink their very first assumptions. And crime analysts say that possibility reportedly shifted how cops viewed huge chunks of the timeline going forward. Now, wrapping up this first part, one thing is glaringly obvious. This renewed focus on the desert evidence reportedly was not about finding one magic bullet to bust the case wide open. It was about cops slowly realizing that much older evidence, ignored terrain, and updated movement guesses might have pointed to a completely different timeline from day one. And in the next part, we will look at exactly which desert clues investigators reportedly went back for. Plus, why experts think the first search theory totally missed one huge possibility right out of the gate. By the time search teams reportedly headed back into the desert, the Nancy Guthrie investigation had already morphed into something totally different. It was not just about what went down inside Nancy's house anymore. Detectives were reportedly trying to figure out if major pieces of the timeline stretched way past what they originally assumed for the search. According to chatter around the case, Brian Entin's reporting allegedly pushed cops to take a hard second look at ignored details about movement, time, and terrain. Here is where things reportedly took a much darker turn. True crime analysts say detectives allegedly realized their first search moves were driven way too hard by the idea that Nancy vanished somewhere close to her own neighborhood. That assumption reportedly dictated exactly where teams dumped all their manpower during those crucial first days. The roads right near her house, the closest desert edges, and the storm drains practically touching the property. But reports claim cops later started wondering if someone who really knew the desert pushed out way further than they ever expected. So, what is the takeaway here? It means detectives reportedly started believing their first search circle did not even come close to matching the real movement timeline. Now, let us hit the first major detail detectives reportedly revisited: vehicle access routes. Based on public reports, investigators allegedly checked out backwoods dirt roads sitting west of that main Tucson search area. A lot of those trails reportedly looked like absolutely nothing during the early days of the hunt. Some barely even showed up on a satellite map. Others were so dead that cops practically ignored them at first. But desert search experts know these remote trails can become massive clues. They let someone move around out there without catching any eyes at all. That reportedly became a huge deal when cops allegedly stacked vehicle timing estimates against updated models of the exact window Nancy vanished. Investigators reportedly have not gone on record saying they caught a specific car using those trails. We need to keep that straight. But sources say detectives allegedly felt some escape routes demanded a closer look after they dug into fresh mapping data. So, what does this mean? It means investigators reportedly lost faith that their initial theories about where the suspect went were actually right. Here is another heavy detail Brian Entin reportedly called out on the ground: search visibility conditions. Reports claim investigators allegedly questioned if the brutal desert environment during those first sweeps practically erased their chances of spotting smaller physical clues. Blinding sun, blowing dust, brutal ground, and absolute zero visibility at night. Arizona desert experts will tell you those brutal factors can completely wreck what search teams manage to spot during a fast initial sweep. That reportedly mattered because cops allegedly found spots that looked totally normal during a rushed sweep, but told a darker story when searched inch by inch. What does that mean? It means investigators reportedly figured some physical evidence was not ignored on purpose. It was just nearly impossible to spot the first time around. Now, let us talk about timing. Because according to reports surrounding the criminal investigation, detectives allegedly started locking in on driving times tied to that infamous missing 41-minute window. Early on, a lot of theories reportedly centered around pretty short driving distances. But true crime analysts say newer case models allegedly proved a suspect could have covered way more ground physically during that exact same time frame. That reportedly flipped how detectives looked at several earlier witness sightings entirely. For example, reports claim at least one ignored witness tip allegedly flagged late-night car activity sitting way outside that original primary search zone. Back then, detectives supposedly brushed the sighting off as unreliable. It just lacked concrete, identifying details, but later, detectives reportedly second-guessed that, wondering if the timing actually fit their updated movement models. What does that mean for the case? It means detectives started looking at old witness tips through a totally fresh timeline. And right there, another glaring contradiction supposedly popped up. Even with all this heat on the desert clues, investigators reportedly still had zero confirmed physical proof linking any suspect to these new search zones. No physical forensics officially tied to Annie, absolutely no surveillance footage released to the public, and zero eyewitnesses who could confirm exactly who drove through those spots during that crucial missing window. That became a massive headache for the investigation. Legal experts say even if detectives feel a theory makes perfect logical sense, they still need hard evidence proving a direct link, not just a maybe. So, what is the takeaway? It shows investigators felt the desert evidence sparked huge questions, but didn't exactly hand them the full answer. Let's shift to another angle. Detectives reportedly looked at how people acted once that renewed search went public. Rumor has it, detectives watched reactions closely the second Brian Entin started shining a spotlight on those completely ignored desert search areas. Who looked anxious? Who suddenly tried walking back their old statements? And who allegedly got super obsessed with talking about the search online? Obviously, detectives know media heat hits everyone differently. Some get defensive just because they hate feeling suspected. Others break down because the case drags painful memories right back into the spotlight. But true crime experts say investigators thought a few specific reactions needed a closer look. Why? Because they matched suspicions already brewing around the timeline. So, what does that mean? It means detectives saw all this post-interview behavior as just another layer of context, not a smoking gun. As we wrap up this part of the story, one thing is glaringly obvious. The renewed focus on those desert spots wasn't just about digging up one dramatic, hidden clue. It was detectives slowly realizing that their old assumptions about travel, timing, and search tactics might have totally crippled their early grip on the case. Word is, Brian Entin's coverage fast-tracked that shift. It forced eyes back onto areas the police might have completely missed during the crazy first days of the investigation. Coming up next, we are going to look at the absolute biggest unanswered question detectives still had hanging over them. If those desert clues were actually so huge, why did it take the cops this long to see what they had? The harder detectives allegedly stared at those desert leads, the more one massive question kept popping up. If these spots were so critical the whole time, why weren't they searched a lot harder back on day one of the investigation? Experts who study massive missing person cases say that exact question might just become the most heavily debated part of the entire Nancy Guthrie story. Why? Because the very first theory usually dictates everything else. And according to case files, detectives originally bet that the biggest clues would be sitting right near Nancy's house in Tucson. That theory reportedly drove the search grid, manpower, and exactly which witness tips got chased down first. But Brian Entin's reporting suggests detectives later wondered if those early hunches just boxed in the whole search way too fast. Here is where the story gets even messier. According to folks tracking the true crime case, police realized a bunch of early witness tips probably got ignored. Why? Because they just did not match the main theory the cops were obsessed with back then. Late-night cars rolling by, weird activity on empty roads, and sketchy timelines near those backway desert entrances. At first, a lot of those clues just felt too vague or random to actually help the case. Later on though, detectives reportedly figured out some of those tips actually fit the new timeline reconstructions way better than anyone realized. So what is the takeaway? It shows investigators started realizing their own early biases, controlled what evidence looked crucial, and what looked like total garbage. Now, let's hit on one specific detail. The cops supposedly went back to constantly travel time. Word is, detectives rebuilt several different driving scenarios to try and fill that missing 41-minute gap. The old models guessed you couldn't drive very far in that short window. But experts following the case say the fresh math proved something else. Someone could have covered way more ground if the conditions were right. That flipped the whole script. If the travel window was actually bigger, then places police originally brushed off as too far away were suddenly back in play. And according to leaks, that lightbulb moment made detectives tear up their old search maps and start over. So what does this mean? It tells us the police probably realized their original timeline locks weren't nearly as rock-solid as they thought. Here is another key thing Brian Entin hammered on: the actual shape of the desert terrain. According to reports, some desert spots detectives revisited had terrain that could easily hide small clues or signs of a struggle. You had to search those areas incredibly slowly to spot anything. Rock crevices, dried wash beds, patches of thick brush, and ground shifts caused by weather. Experts who know the Arizona desert say these rough conditions absolutely wreck visibility and destroy crime scene evidence over time. This became a huge deal. Detectives reportedly started wondering if early search teams pushed too fast through zones that needed a much closer look. Now, that doesn't mean police messed up. Massive searches come with intense pressure, a ticking clock, and hardly any solid facts. But reports suggest detectives felt those brutal terrain challenges just weren't taken seriously enough right out of the gate. So, what's the takeaway here? It means police started seeing the rough environment as a massive reason why those early searches came up empty. Let's look at another detail detectives reportedly dug into: knowing the layout of that exact desert region. Public reports say police looked into whether someone tied to this disappearance actually knew those hidden off-road trails way better than anyone realized. That detail mattered. Why? Because the backroads detectives were revisiting aren't the kind everyday drivers ever use. Some dirt roads had absolutely no signs. Others just disappeared into the brush unless you already knew they were there. Case experts say detectives thought knowing those hidden routes could explain why certain getaway paths got totally missed during the initial missing person search. So, what does this actually mean? It shows investigators believed knowing the local geography played a huge part in how this unfolded. Here's where things get complicated again. Even with all eyes back on the desert evidence, police supposedly still didn't have that one smoking gun to tie the whole theory together. No confirmed forensic clues actually made sense of the timeline. Zero hard evidence ever proved what really went down in those targeted desert search zones. Legal experts say that roadblock made it incredibly tough for detectives trying to turn gut feelings into cold, hard facts. That difference is massive. Why? Because, as detectives know, theories change as you go, but physical evidence has to back up every single claim. What does this mean? It shows police felt the new search angle opened up strong leads, but it still left some massive blank spots in the case. Let's look at the public backlash for a second. Reports show Brian Entin's news coverage totally changed how people viewed this entire missing person investigation. For months, almost everyone following the case was obsessing strictly over the main house. But once the focus shifted out into the desert, people suddenly realized this crime scene was way bigger than anyone had guessed. That sparked fresh outrage. The public demanded to know if police had totally blown their best chances during those first critical search days. Case watchers say all that heat forced the department to heavily review their own early search calls. So, what's the bottom line? It shows the case didn't just shift from finding fresh clues. Old evidence got a second look simply because the public kept the heat on. As we wrap up this part of the story, one detail is glaring. The desert evidence mattered not because it broke the case wide open overnight. It mattered because it forced cops to question assumptions they trusted way too much. Travel times, search grids, whether certain witnesses were actually lying, and the terrifying idea that Nancy Guthrie's actual disappearance went miles further past her front door than anyone originally thought. Up next, we're diving into the absolute creepiest question detectives started asking behind closed doors. If that first search theory was totally half-baked, was major evidence tied to Nancy's vanishing sitting right there in plain sight all along? As police kept tearing through the desert evidence, the entire case pivoted toward a really dark thought. What if the biggest clues were never actually buried at all? What if detectives just suffered from tunnel vision when they built that timeline on day one? Experts tracking the Nancy Guthrie case say, that question haunted detectives. Especially once fresh crime scene models, past searches, and weird witness sightings actually started matching up. Reports show Brian Entin's updates really shoved that failure right into the spotlight. And this is exactly where the story takes a very grim turn. Police reportedly woke up to the fact that their early search strategy relied entirely on one blind assumption. They firmly believed whatever happened to Nancy stayed right on the property. So early on, cops threw everything at the house. They checked the driveway, blind spots in the security cameras, and the lawn. Honestly, that plan made sense at first. The dead camera feeds, the weird motion alerts, and that sketchy 41-minute gap, it all pointed to the house. But true crime experts say, detectives eventually worried that obsessing over the house totally stalled the wider desert search. So, what's the real story here? It proves that the very first police theory completely hijacked how the initial search was handled, far more than anyone wanted to admit. Let's shift to another major clue. Detectives went back to search overlap. Based on reports released to the public, multiple crews combed through parts of that desert terrain at different stages of the missing person investigation: volunteer searchers, local police, specialty units, and later, secondary review squads. But experts who know complex search and rescue operations say hitting the same spot repeatedly doesn't mean every square inch gets equal attention. Some searchers move fast, some just scan wide open areas. Others check the terrain differently, depending entirely on whatever working theory guides the operation.
That suddenly mattered when detectives went back over how early crews documented specific remote trails and washout spots that later became huge points of interest. Reports show detectives allegedly realized certain locations only got a quick, passing glance during those critical early sweeps of the desert. So, what does that actually mean? It means investigators believed chunks of the search grid were technically covered on paper, but never actually searched up close. Here's another massive issue journalist Brian Entin reportedly pointed out: the sheer emotional pressure detectives faced during those early days. Sources say law enforcement operated under insane urgency the second Nancy went missing and the public found out. The news coverage exploded. The local community demanded answers. And detectives reportedly faced huge pressure to provide instant answers, long before the actual timeline of events even made sense. Experts who know how these high-profile true crime cases work say, that kind of chaos can push cops to jump on whatever theory looks most obvious right out of the gate, not because they are sloppy, but because you have to make fast choices when you only have half the puzzle.
That mattered big time, because detectives later realized they might have tossed out a few early witness statements way too fast just because they didn't fit the main theory they had back then. So, why does that matter? It means investigators allegedly started wondering if that initial panic drove them to prioritize the wrong pieces of evidence early on. Now, let's circle back to those movement estimates. Based on the reports leaking out about the case, updated crime scene models showed someone who really knew that desert could cover way more ground within that narrow timeline window than anyone thought. That realization supposedly flipped how cops looked at a bunch of ignored access roads. Experts tracking the investigation say, detectives got extremely interested in whether someone moved through the remote desert during those short time gaps they previously wrote off as impossible for travel. To be clear, law enforcement has never officially stated what they actually think went down during that exact time frame. But sources claim detectives realized their original geographic theories just did not match up with the physical evidence anymore. What is the takeaway here? It means police reportedly think the timeline of events was way more flexible than they originally assumed. Here is where another major contradiction supposedly pops up. Even with all eyes glued to that new desert evidence, investigators supposedly face the exact same problem they have had for months: a total lack of hard, definitive proof. Not a single confirmed piece of forensic evidence tied this updated theory together. There is zero direct proof showing exactly who drove through those backroads and desert entry points. Detectives kept revisiting. Legal experts point out that massive missing link remains one of the investigation's biggest roadblocks. Because gut feelings, crime scene reconstructions, and criminal profiling might point cops somewhere, but ultimately, you still need ironclad evidence to lock up a conviction. So, what does that mean? It means detectives allegedly felt they were figuring out the timeline, even if they could not completely prove every single step of it yet. Let's quickly talk about where Annie fits into this shifting theory. Based on all the noise surrounding the case, Detectives supposedly kept digging into whether Annie's actual relationship with Nancy, mixed with her knowledge of daily routines and personal drama, perfectly fit those new timeline models the cops were building. Once again, police played it safe. No official statement ever outright accused her of direct involvement, and experts say detectives knew exactly how dangerous rushing to conclusions can be in cases this huge. Even so, sources suggest investigators felt too many weird coincidences kept pointing straight back to those exact same messy relationship dynamics. What does this mean? It shows detectives saw the personal relationship timeline as deeply tied to the actual geographic movements of the case. Wrapping up this fourth part, one detail is getting genuinely impossible to ignore. This investigation did not shift because the cops suddenly stumbled onto one magic smoking gun. It shifted because detectives slowly realized their first theory just didn't cover the full true crime timeline. And based on reports out there, journalist Brian Entin and his reporting basically forced everyone to re-examine ignored terrain, bad assumptions, and crazy possibilities that the police completely underestimated during the chaotic first days of the manhunt. But in the finale, we'll explore the most logical conclusion investigators allegedly reached behind closed doors, and why the Nancy Guthrie cold case stays unsolved, despite years of searching, reconstructions, and endless analysis.